Good morning, I'm Elaine Savoury and I'm the current chair of the Ayrshire Equality Partnership, which is a multi-agency group across Ayrshire and has representation from all the public bodies. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning for this first of our 2 deaf awareness sessions, which has been hosted by Deaf Scotland. Just a few housekeeping rules before we start. Just to let people know, the session is being recorded this morning so that we can use it for training for future. If we could ask, if you could keep your mic on mute, and if you've got any questions, if you could use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Whilst Janice is presenting, I will keep an eye on the chat function, and we'll take a break midway in order to answer any questions. And then if there are any further questions after the second part of Janice's presentation, we'll pick them up at the end. Just to let people know, there is a BSL interpreter and an electronic note taker today, and they will be pinned so that they remain on the screen. And I think with that, and without much further ado, I'll hand over to Janice McDonald, Chief Executive at Deaf Scotland. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Elaine. I want to say, firstly, something about Deaf Scotland. Secondly, a tiny bit about myself, and mostly to try and give you a basic framework around deafness, which might be helpful. And there's a limit to what we can do in this amount of time. So trying to be as helpful as possible, I think, is the best starting point. Deaf Scotland's been around 94 years nearly now, and I haven't been around all that time. It's worked originally as a deaf-led, user-led organisation. It started involving organisations about 30 years ago. So we remain a membership-based organisation. We do have organisations and individual members. Those members cover a range of organisations and what we call a spectrum of deafness. We embrace diversity. We promote the social model of disability, and we work to a human rights approach. I think all those things are quite important, and I can follow up on some of them later. We describe a spectrum of deafness really to try and help people understand that within that range, there are maybe what we currently call 4 key pillars. Probably as time goes on, that will be further differentiated, but we try not to categorise people. We would prefer if you take a person-centred approach, but within the key pillars, we talk about those who are deaf, those who are deafened, those who are deaf-blind, and those who are hard of hearing. And why we do that is really to understand that people mainly experience different barriers and there are different solutions for those. And why the differentiation? Deaf people would be inclined to be born deaf, most likely to have sign language as their first and often only language, because one of the key problems with being born deaf is acquiring language. Not everyone who's born deaf would be part of the deaf community, and the deaf community is generally made up of people who will have significant deafness, either from birth, often from early years, or in later life, but they've felt that sign language becomes a preferred means of communication, and they get involved in that community. As I said earlier, we embrace diversity, and I don't have time this morning to go into a lot of the issues around BSL and the deaf community, but I want to raise the fact that people who are born deaf would see themselves as linguistically challenged. They're not necessarily disabled, because if we all used sign language better, the way that we used to in the past, then there wouldn't be the same barriers between us. So the language barrier is important. People who are deaf-blind can experience similar language barriers. They may start off with spoken language and move to tactile, or it may be tactile from birth. There's not a lot of people that are significantly deaf-blind from birth. Often people are born with conditions that mean they have hearing or sight loss first, and the other sense goes over a period of time, it's lost and doesn't function as well. Things like Usher syndrome, you may have heard of, is probably the most significant one in Scotland at the moment. And that means that people eventually get to a stage where their both senses are problematic and they may have to revert to tactile language, and often prepare for that transition by using tactile language as a preferred option. We've got hard of hearing, which is probably the most significant number in the community in Scotland. And that ranges from mild to moderate hearing loss and is often determined by someone having the use of hearing aids. And sometimes that's one, sometimes it's two. It may be a cochlear implant these days. So effectively, I'm describing 4 key elements, but people come as a mixed bag with different communication methods, different language access methods. Some deaf-blind people, for example, might be using Braille as a tactile method. So just to give you an understanding of the communication and language barriers, they're not always as straightforward as you imagine. And sign language wouldn't be the panacea for everyone, although if you do start off with sign language, it can help with transitions to tactile language. I hope that's making sense so far. There's a couple of key things I'd like to say that I find very useful. First of all, in terms of our children, our deaf children's attainment is not nearly so good as their hearing peers. But the figures that we have through CRIDE would determine that effectively the children who are hard of hearing are not performing as well as those children who come from backgrounds where sign language is strong in the family. So there are indications that where communication and language is strongly present, people do better than when they're having to maybe bridge 2 languages or struggle to get communication support in the language that they're using. We're fearful that our children leave school with an average reading age of between 7 and 9 years. And it's not really anything to do with reflecting their capability. It's more to do with the way that we're teaching them and maybe not supporting them as well as we might. So that's a key campaigning pillar or plank of our work, really trying to make sure that our deaf children leave school as well equipped as possible. There's quite a lot of work to be done on that. There's about 3,800 deaf children in Scotland at the moment. There could be about 2,000 children a year born. Many children will be born with things like glue ear or conditions that may improve over their childhood, while others may have conditions that worsen. So in terms of the profile of deafness in Scotland, there's about 12,500 sign language users. We don't imagine they're all deaf sign language users because the question used in the census is, do you use BSL at home? So we imagine that there's about 7,500 deaf people who use BSL at home, and the others would be family members who are using that language to communicate. There's about 4,000 significantly deaf-blind people and about 27,000 who would have significant dual sensory loss. These would be people at the older age of the spectrum who have got significant sight and hearing loss. There's about 700,000 who would be described as hard of hearing, and there would be about 355,000 described as deafened. That would be some sort of significant hearing loss. And people who are deafened will be predominantly accessing in spoken language, but they may need things like electronic note-taking, subtitles, captions, or rely on lip reading to make themselves understood and to understand others. I want to say something now about that older age range and the problems that Scotland might face in the future. We know we've got an ageing population anyway, and there is an age skew with deafness. So around about age 40, about 40% of the population have some sort of hearing loss. Around about age 60, so about 60% of the population have some sort of hearing loss. And then around about 75, that escalates to 90%. So the chances are the longer you live, the more likely you are to have loss. And the longer you live, the more likely that loss will be to get more significant. So we do need to understand that there are some key transitions from nursery to school, from school to the workplace or higher further education, in employment, and then out of employment into retirement and older age. I believe as people are working longer, we're going to have to do a lot more in the workplace, for example, to make sure that that communication is as smooth as possible and that people don't get to the stage, as happens at the moment, where the communication is a barrier and people leave the workplace often through mental health problems, anxiety and depression, because they're not keeping up with the communication and the speed at which things are happening within their organisation. You'll see today, because we've got BSL interpreters and we've got electronic note-taking, that we have to be paced, take more breaks, and consider our communications much more thoroughly. That's the sort of key areas of framework that I think are quite helpful to understand key issues for our young people, to understand those issues that face us all as we're aging, and think about how society is managing the deafness. In my opinion, we don't consider enough about the environmental impact, making sure that we're in quiet spaces, that we're not in large echoey rooms, that we do have things like hearing loops available, whether they're installed, which are much better quality, or whether they're portable. But also to understand that when we're using hearing loops, we would be better to use a microphone. The loops will channel the sound much better that way than just trying to pick up any sound that's echoing around your room. So there's a whole lot of understanding about the environmental side. And I often say that my deafness, I would describe myself as hard of hearing. My deafness is mostly environmental. I struggle in access, for example. We talk about access a lot. I can't often hear to get into door entry systems. I find problems if I break down on the motorway. I'm not so able to telephone at the breakdown junctions. A couple of times my car's been stuck in high-rise car parks because I've not noticed that they close at 10 o'clock, and I've gone to get my car and it tells you to phone a number. I've had to get assistance to phone that number to be able to get my car out of the car park. So lots of wee things that people take for granted, particularly the white goods in your kitchen. You'll find that people tell me that a lot of the white goods these days beep. They tell you when their cycles are finished and things. I can't hear that generally. So I get a wee bit more anxious in the house because I'm having to check the time to see if the washing machine's finished and whatever. So I always tell people I've got a real level of stress that's probably I just take for granted. But if I'm going to someplace new and I don't understand the acoustics and I don't know how to get in, then by the time I get there, I'm really quite stressed. I can feel myself needing to have a wee cup of tea and try and have 5 minutes before I get on with the business of communication. The reason that I'm there is often compounded. My emotions about being in a strange place, meeting new people, are often compounded by the physical acts of just getting there. That's worse, as I imagine, for people who are deafblind, who need to be maybe involving guide communicators and making journeys that are much more complex as compared to my experiences. So I do find within the 4 pillars of deafness that we don't always understand each other's barriers and the solutions as well as we might. I forget sometimes that it's helpful to audio describe for deaf-blind people because they're not seeing the colours or the shapes and forms and things that are going on in front of them the way that we might take for granted. I think other things, if someone's deafened, then often getting to a stage where there's a hearing loop at a reception or whatever is not enough, that people might need to revert to a notepad and paper. People might be able to, as they can in Renfrewshire Council, use an iPad and book in electronic note-taking so that speeds up the process. A lot of people have liked the move, actually, that COVID has created from physical to digital communications, because there is an advantage in being able to use captions and subtitles in some of the communications packages. And it is easier for me and many people to lip read, looking at the pictures and understand the sounds through use of earphones that would be clouded if you're actually in a public room and there's a lot of people in it. One of the loneliest places for me is being in a public reception or something where there's quite a high level of background noise, and it's almost impossible to have a one-to-one with anyone because I just can't hear what they're saying. So I suppose what I'm trying to get across is also that there's a level of stress or mental health that borderlines on distress sometimes and mental ill health, and we don't always compensate for that either. I would say 2 or 3 things about COVID. The actual virus itself becomes a communication barrier in the sense that it affects people's breathing, and the techniques to speak become affected quite easily, which makes communication different and difficult. The mitigating steps that we have to take to prevent the transfer of the virus are very difficult for people affected by deafness. The social distancing is a problem. Most of you may know that hearing aids are designed to work at a 1 metre distance. That's the normal sort of social distance as opposed to the 2 metres. So being further away from people makes it more difficult for their hearing aids to work effectively. Even if you have a hearing loop or a portable hearing loop in the room, it would still be more difficult. The masks, face coverings are a problem. A lot of people are not conscious that they lip read or they look at the lip patterns as well as what they're hearing to understand what people are saying. There's an element of guesswork when you're not communicating well. If you understand the context of the conversation, you can probably guess the words much easier. And the full face coverings make that very problematic. But even the transparent masks are not received particularly well. Some people will prefer them because there is a degree of safety. But the reality is, unless you're deaf and you're only relying on the lip patterns, then the masks all tend to muffle the sound. So most people are relying on that combination of the lip pattern and the sound, and the face coverings make it quite difficult, which is why there is an exemption about lowering the mask in circumstances that are feasible to do that. So we know in different areas where PPE is required, that's not always possible, although some places have been able to adapt a combination of distance, use of visors, and the more open masks and things like that as a mechanism to assist. I do think sometimes that's where you do need to revert to pen and paper, or to actually try to do work over digital means. Glasgow Health Board, for example, bought hundreds of Chromebooks, laptops and iPads to put into their clinical settings to help assist with communications, whether that be within the hospital and within the ward. Quite often at ward rounds and things, BSL users are able to use the electronic interpreting, but also other people affected by deafness are able to access the remote note-taking, which can help. There's definitely issues about keeping in touch with your family. And I suppose what I would say is the other thing around the shielding and the distancing and the increased isolation is we know people affected by deafness are at much higher risk of mental ill health anyway, 3 to 5 times as much as the mainstream community. All those things are exacerbated as they were in the mainstream community. So, you know, the realities of COVID have been quite difficult for people to face. And there's still a lot of people that are telling us that they're really anxious about going out because it's very difficult for them to face and negotiate the communication barriers. Now, we know people in the mainstream are complaining about face coverings. So it's important that we understand the compounding of pressures on people. I think one of the difficult things around deafness is the fact that people tend to self-isolate because it becomes more difficult to communicate. It becomes easier to stay in the house, not go to those nights out, not go to those family celebrations, because it's just too difficult to keep up with what's going on. And that isolation breeds in itself a lot more anxiety. So that idea of keeping people healthy and their well-being being quite important means that we do have to consider how we transfer from face-to-face to online consultations, and how we use things like Near Me or Zoom or Teams to help. I think that there's bits about just understanding that, you know, even me going for a walk, it's very difficult for me to pick up what people are saying when we're walking side by side. I'm more inclined to walk for a bit with people and then want to sit down to have a chat, want to take a break and have a chat. So it's just understanding that environmental impact that I was talking about earlier, to make sure that you are face-to-face, to make sure that you're in an environment that's conducive to being very focused on the communication and making that deaf person feel that you are really wanting to communicate with them. If you're trying to say things and run away from them, or you're not looking up from your desk, you know, all the wee things that happen quite often, you may not be so conscious, but all those things make people feel maybe a wee bit less respected, and it does kind of eat away at the confidence. I always think deafness is a hidden disability, and a lot of it is by default. We know what good communication looks like, but we're always a bit busy and we're always a bit pushed to do it that well all the time. And what I would suggest is that if you're working predominantly with older people, that you might want to take stock and think about how your routine communications are going, because you might be able to skew them a wee bit and make them better for people, even just by making sure you're putting things up in a blackboard or putting things on a notice or whatever. And the most obvious thing that always comes to my mind when I talk about process, and that's the audiology clinics that shout people that, you know, Mr. Smith, that's your audiology appointment, because Mr. Smith definitely doesn't hear them. So actually having the wee notice with Mr. Smith's name on makes all the difference. So I've given it a few tips. We've talked about that sort of hospital appointment scenario, and you know that hollering people's names, and you know, thinking that if somebody's not hearing you well, to speak louder doesn't often work, and we would say speak a bit slower. Also, maybe enunciate a wee bit better, but don't over pronounce your words, or that becomes difficult to lip read. But also to think about rephrase, which is another wee thing that you can store away in the back of your mind. If somebody's not picking up what you're saying, you can repeat it. If they're not picking it up the second time, try to rephrase it, say it in a different way, because there are some sounds that are just much more difficult to distinguish than others. And it might be that if you rephrase what you're saying, it's much easier. Please don't. People talk quite a lot about, you know, if somebody says to them, "Oh, it doesn't matter. I'll tell you later, or I'll email you, or something like that. That feels quite dismissive as well, and that can eat away at people. So there's wee bits of hints and tips about things that we can all do when we're busy that I'm maybe just wanting to highlight, because it's Deaf Awareness Week and we want to understand the humanity, the human element of what is happening when communication is not going so well. I think my final big point would be around the quality of communication and understanding that actually when communication is not going very well, people get frustrated very quickly. And I find that, we talk about, if me with a hearing loss, if I'm on a desert island myself, I don't have a communication barrier. It's only a problem when I want to communicate with someone and they want to communicate back at me. What I would say is that to understand if there's a communication problem, that the problem's in the middle between the 2 or the 5 or the 10 people who are trying to work across that communication. You will see a process solution today where we've got interpreters and we've got electronic note takers. That is the oil that eases the communication for different participants. And without that lubricant, it becomes very difficult. But people can communicate, and they communicate quite often beyond language and beyond borders. If you go on foreign holidays, we use visuals, we use symbols, we use pictures quite a lot. In many places abroad, you'll get your menu with a picture of a pizza on it and just various toppings, as opposed to a menu that's all in words, or you get the symbols. And I always think it's actually quite easy to navigate in symbols around the world. It's not so easy to navigate around some of our hospital campuses and different things because we use different words for the same thing. Even if I take the example of public toilets, there are consistent signs, symbols for public toilets, and then there are many places you go that don't use those signs. And if you're confused, if you've got dementia, if you've maybe got learning difficulties, then that change of those symbols becomes a problem. So things about consistency of practice are really quite important as well. I believe quite strongly it's actually communication that makes us human. The level and the degree and the nuances of our communication are brilliant. We do it across sign, across visuals, across symbols, with mime, with various means. It doesn't always have to be reading, writing, and spoken. And if it is, it doesn't always have to be what my mother would have called highfalutin words. We can choose our vocabulary, we can choose our language pitch, and we can work across various communication issues, I would say, if we're quite careful. And we're pretty skilled at doing that quite a lot. We just don't always think about the degrees of it all the time. So I go back to saying there's some simple things for deaf people, like don't do everything in the visuals, because it might be too much to take in. What we would call visual noise. Sometimes you go into a room and there's so many different wee bits of direction and notices, you don't know which is the important one, and you can't see the arrow that points to reception. So there's just a wee bit of understanding and working with people to find out what their preferences are. Is there anything else, Elaine, in the questions that we would want to record?
Yes, Janice, we've got a specific question from someone who works with apprentices, and they were wondering if they had an apprentice with hearing loss, how could they assist them with their qualification and communicating with them? So what could we do specifically for apprentices to support them?
The first thing I would always say would be to ask the person themselves. They might have preferences that will help. But I would say to be conscious of your communications. It might be worth, when you're doing team meetings and things like that, to use, we do it quite often in our place, we use a shared document to write up certain things. We use electronic note takers quite a lot. So we can actually put our conversation in words or on the digital screen, or we used to put it up on the wall in the office on a screen in the wall, or on a big TV. Some people used software like mind mapping to be able then just to help people follow the conversations and understand what the context is about. It's particularly difficult when you're deaf, when the context of a conversation shifts from one topic to another, just to catch up with that. And the other thing that I would say personally is it's quite difficult to understand who's talking. By the time I've worked out if there's a group of people talking, who is talking, I've probably missed the first part of what they're saying. So by the time I've figured out who's talking and got the second part of what they're saying and processed it, then I think that I'm a bit behind. I'll come up with a question and the conversation has moved on again. And it can be quite irritating for people in groups then to have to go back to the previous topics. But to understand that a wee bit like the airwaves, with people like myself, there's a wee bit of a time delay sometimes. So what we do is we factor more breaks into what we're doing to allow time for that processing to catch up. I talked earlier about access. I've talked a bit about process, which are really quite important. Because, for example, I can access Argos, I can order my goods online, but if I need to change the delivery date, the process determines that I have to telephone to do that. The process doesn't allow me to do that online. So there's bits about thinking about how your access is working, how your processes are joining up, and obviously to take feedback from people, but then also to think about participation. I always think that the best thing that you can do is to work around lived experience, and there's a whole lot of lived experience round about you. So in your workplace, for example, you could have a wee access panel of sorts, a wee group that looks at things that can help to make communication better, because it might not just be a deaf person that's struggling, if that makes sense. And so I don't know, I hope that's answered your question. There's a few things there, and there might be particular things that you need to put in place and consider something like access to work. We've got staff in our office who have access to work packages that help to support both electronic note taking and interpreting. So there can be gadgets or software, equipment, and training that can be brought to bear that will help your organisation.
Thank you, Janice. Just to let people know, there is a few pieces of information within the chat function. Deaf Scotland have awareness bites that are online training courses. Public Health Scotland also has a BSL training course, but we will email out to everyone again after that, and we'll include these links to ensure everyone has access to them.
If your organisation is part of a community planning partnership, then you would have access to a lot of online training. The other thing I would say in terms of a parting shot would be around accessible information and inclusive communication. People tend to get them mixed up. Accessible information is delivering what you want to say in a way that's accessible for people in a format that they can use, like Easy Read or like a BSL clip with subtitles and voiceover. So putting your information out in different formats is quite important to allow a range of people to understand what you want to convey. Inclusive communication is much more about that rounded process. It's dynamic and it allows for the 2 or 3 or 5-way communications that need to happen to make actions happen. So I always say accessible information is a bit like getting invited to the party. It's the invitation, but you won't go to the party if you don't think anybody's going to dance with you. So if you've not got your inclusive communication sort of organised, you don't understand how communication's working within your organisation, then there will be people who are not engaging with you through choice. And there's an obvious one. If you're having activities and you don't put your information out about them in British Sign Language, for example, then how are BSL users supposed to know about it? You are relying on someone communicating with them. How are tactile deafblind people supposed to know about what you're doing unless you make links with the people that are working with them? So there is that bit about what I call assertive outreach, and just making sure that you're not taking for granted that people know about what you're doing because you're putting information out in a fairly limited way.